The OBGYN part of me, I can think of numerous women who I have seen in my medical practice in the past who come in with physical complaints, but as we start talking, there may or may not be a physical component that I can detect on examination or testing. But when I find out some of the things that are going on in their lives, whether it's trauma or relationship breakdown or, overwhelming stress, and their body is getting the fallout, I think we pay attention to that far too infrequently. Where does it hurt? Anytime you've been to see a doctor, they probably ask you that question. Where does it hurt? I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for being with me today. The whole topic of healing, wholeness, it's such a big and important one. Now, the question, where does it hurt? You first think about your body. But there are many deeper ways in which that very question gets to some roots of where we need healing. I am talking today with a friend, Amy Julia Becker. She's an award-winning writer and speaker. She has written a recent book, To Be Made Well, an invitation to wholeness, healing, and hope, that addresses these themes. It's a very interesting time for me to be talking about health and wellness and healing and so on. I am recovering from a bit of laryngitis. Now, my voice is pretty okay today, but if you've been listening to me and know me well, you may be able to hear just a remaining bit of scratchiness in my voice. So I have been through a period of needing some healing myself just in the last few days. But wherever you are hurting, I believe this will be a very encouraging and I pray healing program for you personally, as well as letting you think about some ways in which God may be inviting you to minister healing to others in your world. Amy Julia Becker. Amy Julia Becker, I am looking forward to this conversation. First of all, just a big welcome and thank you for spending some time on our program today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. The topic of healing, that is something, personal to each of us, but for me, this is quite a personal topic. Those of you who have been listening to me for a while know that I am a physician by training, and I realized fairly early on in my medical career that I could do surgery, I could write prescriptions, I could deliver babies, but I couldn't heal anybody. And that was part of what actually pointed me to theology and ministry training. And I know that for you, healing and health and all that has been personal, both in your own body and your family. Let's just start there.
Yeah, there are so many facets to healing. And I think one of the things that you're kind of hinting at, and that certainly I've been writing about, is how in our context in the West, especially, we tend to equate healing with doctors and medicine and hospitals. And there's certainly a role in being made well for medicine and hospitals and surgeries and all those things. And yet, I'm coming at it also with a theological lens, right? Thinking as a Christian and as someone who has really studied the scriptures and thought about healing there. And one of the things that I learned early on in investigating all of this is that there's not really a word in the Bible that talks about biomedical fixing of our bodies, right? Like that healing or health in the Bible is more associated with relationships that have been repaired or restored, whether that's a relationship to God, to ourselves, or to each other. And so that's a different lens on healing, which again doesn't negate the role of medicine, but it certainly expands everything else, I think, when we start talking about healing. And that's been true for me when I think about my own body, when I think about my own relationships. And actually, though, I think there is pain that shows up in our body when we are in broken relationships with ourselves, with our communities, with God. And it's also been true because I have a daughter with a disability, and I've been thinking about what is healing when it comes to questions of chronic pain, chronic illness, and disability, which is a different category in and of itself. So there are all sorts of ways to think about healing, and it's bigger than just doctors and medicine.
Exactly. You referenced something early in your book, To Be Made Well, that resonated with me about many people in the West and even in the Christian church have bought into, perhaps unknowingly, some of the old, Platonism, spirit and body are separate.
Yeah.
And, spirit is good, material things are bad. And just that disconnect. And then when the Enlightenment came, going totally to, the material and rational and science. Hebrew scriptures, the Christian tradition, and how Jesus dealt with people really is a different paradigm.
Yeah, that was so helpful for me to recognize that there are these two different ways that I have broken apart the body from the spirit. One that followed the ancient Greeks, one that followed more modern, but the past 500 years of Enlightenment thinking, but
Yes.
neither of which actually dealt with us as a whole person, right? That body, mind, and spirit are integrated. And even the fact that we need to talk about it as these three distinct parts of us, when the experience in our bodies is that our minds and our spirits and our bodies are interconnected, and yet we don't even, I mean, I don't have the language for that other than to separate those parts. And yet my experience has been, when I start to connect the spiritual and emotional aspects of who I am, my thinking, my feeling, and my prayer life to my physical existence, there is so much more healing that can happen, both in terms of like actual cessation of pain,
Yeah.
but also in terms of just that expansive experience of God and of wholeness in the world.
You share some stories in your book that are very personal about your own body, your own physical experience of that. We could probably spend a long time talking about just that, and we won't. But I'd love you to highlight how you experience that in your own body.
Yeah, so this book really started 7 or 8 years ago when I was experiencing chronic lower back pain. And I had not done some specific thing to injure my back either. I just had persistent lower back pain that woke me up in the middle of the night. And it got to a point where every night I was taking Advil in order to be able to fall back to sleep. And I just thought, this is not right. And I tried all sorts of things, and I, did core strengthening exercises, and I got a new mattress and told my kids, I can't pick you up. I'm just going to be really gentle with myself and careful. And then I finally sat down with a yoga teacher someone had recommended. And I said, I just feel like things are out of alignment in my body. And she said, anytime I hear someone say that things are out of alignment, I think something's out of alignment in your life, not in your body. And those words were a prompt to me to start talking. And I guess I kind of knew all of this was going on, but it's like, actually, I don't know who I am right now because
Yes.
I'm only seen as a wife and a mom. And I like being a wife and a mom, but that's not all there is to me. And I don't know how to pray right now. And I am, I'm flailing in my life in lots of different ways. And as I talked about that, I could really feel this persistent pain that had been with me for a long time dissipate, which was very confusing to me for a couple of reasons. Like, one, as a Christian, I did not understand why sitting on a yoga mat and talking to someone who is not, and it felt like a miraculous healing, I should say. I didn't know why this would be happening. And then two, nothing in my life had changed. I was
Sure.
still confused about my identity. I was still stressed out. I was still, not treating my body particularly well, in terms of what I was putting into it with lack of exercise and eating and all these different things. And I said that to her. I said, I'm confused because talking to you has not fixed anything. Why do I feel better? And she said, you don't need to fix all your problems in order for healing to happen, but you do need to acknowledge the source of the pain.
Wow.
That was the beginning of a real mind shift for me in terms of, I guess, actually like an invitation to acknowledge pain, not for the sake of dwelling on pain, but for the sake of beginning a healing work and trusting that God actually does not want us to be in pain. And yet sometimes our bodies use pain as a signal so that we can
Yes.
pay attention to these places that need healing.
Yes. The OBGYN part of me, I can think of numerous women who I have seen in my medical practice in the past who come in with physical complaints, but as we start talking, there may or may not be a physical component that I can detect on examination or testing. But when I find out some of the things that are going on in their lives, whether it's trauma or relationship breakdown or, overwhelming stress, and their body is getting the fallout, I think we pay attention to that far too infrequently.
Well, it is this sense that we experience stress in our bodies when it comes from any mechanism, right? So if
Yeah.
it's the stress of lifting a heavy object, we kind of are like, oh, sure, I felt that in my body, and we're not surprised. But if it's the stress of a relational breakdown, it surprises us that we might feel that in our bodies.
Yeah.
And yet, I mean, as you know, of course, as a physician, there's so much literature that documents the fact that
Yes.
there are all these different ways in which we can experience stress. And if we don't know how to deal with them emotionally or spiritually, they will show up in our bodies in really painful. I mean, sometimes it's injury, sometimes it's disease, sometimes it's more like what I was experiencing, where it was just a chronic pain that would not have shown up on an MRI,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need different tools than just medication in order to try to address those types of stresses and pains, I believe.
Yeah. You think about this and write about this theologically, and take scripture right into the middle of how you process all this information. For the many people who are listening or listening to or watching us know the stories in the gospel where Jesus brings miraculous healing to people in their bodies. The
Mhm.
stories are pretty dramatic, and uh, how that relates to our world today. Certainly, we know much more of the biology and physiology scientifically, but is Jesus still involved? How do we think about prayer and relationship with God in relation to the healing that we need? Talk about how you put that into this idea of healing.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's such a big one. I think for a long time, and this kind of goes back to my like mind body split. I think for a long time as a Christian, it wasn't that I didn't believe that Jesus had healed people,
Yeah.
but I kind of thought that had been replaced by antibiotics and antidepressants, like, and so I was like, yeah, that's really cool. And it shows that Jesus was powerful and that he was compassionate. And now we have hospitals. But when I started really investigating these healing stories, I noticed a number of things. And one was that although so many of the healing stories do happen as this like instantaneous transformation, Jesus also seems to downplay the miraculous nature of what's happening and really emphasize some other aspects of what's going on. So, for example, you have the paralyzed man who is brought before Jesus by his friends,
Yeah.
and Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven." And you're like, is that why we're here? Like what's going on? And in order to demonstrate that Jesus has the authority to forgive sins, he says, "Get up, take your mat, and
Yeah.
walk." So there is a physical healing and it is miraculous. And yet there's an indication in that story of like, the forgiveness is the miracle here, people. The forgiveness is the healing. And we see that, I think, in other places. So there's a woman who washes Jesus's hair with her feet with her hair.
Yes.
And Jesus says to her, and the way our Bible's translated is, "Your faith has saved you,"
Yep.
when he's talking to her about that. The exact same words are the words that Jesus uses when he talks to Bartimaeus after he has gone from being blind to seeing. And when he talks to a leper who has come back to say thank you, and because his skin has been, cleared up, and when he talks to a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, whose bleeding has stopped. And so this experience this woman's having, which has nothing that we can tell about her physical body, where she's, saying thank you to Jesus, he sees that as a healing experience as much as these other people's experience of physical healing. So there's a relationship between the spiritual and the physical for Jesus that certainly applies to us today. Also, the other thing that I think is really important about Jesus's healing is it's always in the context of a community. So
Yes.
there's always a sense of this is not just an isolated individual, but a restoration of an individual two, a relationship with God, a relationship of wholeness within themselves, and a relationship to a community. And that's, again, something that was really important to me to begin to understand, that there's a social component to healing that we all get to be a part of and are kind of, I think, sent out by God when we experience healing to be a part of. And some of that is going to happen on the like cessation of physical pain, but
Sure.
also when we talk on those bigger levels about social divisions and places where we are
Yeah.
stuck as a society because of unforgiveness or because of systems that are oppressive and destructive, there's a healing that God wants to equip us to be a part of, I think, in those social ways. And we see that starting with Jesus too.
Mm. That is so powerful. You're talking about the Greek word sozo, which is often translated healing or saved. Is salvation.
Yeah,
Same Greek word, and we in the West differentiate that, but Jesus didn't. And
right.
the wholeness that he came to bring us is so interconnected there. You're also referencing the social part. I have been fascinated in the last few years studying and reading about neurobiology and the interpersonal nature of how our being functions. And today we are learning. I'm an OBGYN. This is just stuff I read and study and listen
Yeah.
to, and I find it fascinating. But we now know biologically things are different in us that we can measure in the presence of someone else. God created us that way. Such an important part of who he intended us to be and what the wholeness that he came to bring us for is all about.
And we see the ways that our social breakdowns
Yes.
affect our physical bodies, whether that's like loneliness and isolation, which is, I'm sure you know this, but as negative of a health factor as smoking many cigarettes a day, right? But then similarly, whether it's something like, pollution that affects our lungs or gives a child asthma, right? Like there are these kind of social
Sure.
um, ills that affect us physically, but also we can have seen, even if we look at the data around COVID over the past 2 years, that different people
Yes.
groups are affected
Yes.
differently. And some of that, you can maybe say, okay, this group of people eats differently than this group of people. But there's also just a stress that I think when people who are on the margins, whether that's because of poverty or because of race or for other factors, all of those things really can affect us in terms of our health and well-being. And I think that's also a place where we all can look at, what does it mean to be a part of healing here, and how does God want us to bring healing love, not only so that people with lower back pain feel better, but
Yep.
actually so that there's a healing that can happen across some of our social divides as well.
Mm. So important. And one of the statements you make near the end of your book, To Be Made Whole, the only way healing happens is if love goes deeper than the wound. That really stood out to me. Certainly that applies physically, but even much more emotionally, socially,
Yeah.
the really deep parts of ourselves. I want to talk about something that I know many Christians who are listening to or watching us right now may be thinking. And they may be thinking, well, Jesus healed. If he still heals, why aren't I healed? I've been doing everything I know to do. I've been praying and I still hurt. Or in the situation like with your daughter who has Down syndrome, and you talk so beautifully and lovingly about her, she still has Down syndrome. What does healing look like for people with a chronic condition who are praying or a disability? What's healing for them?
Yeah, so I don't have one blanket answer. And yet I
Yeah.
do feel like, again, I have often seen healing way too narrowly. So I think there
Yes.
are a variety of things. Like, one, there's healing that happens. I think healing is available to each of us and to all of us. So no matter what your condition, healing is available to you. Often that's not going to look the way you expect it. And that
Sure.
is
Yes.
whether that's like me not expecting a miraculous sense of relief, or the people I know who are incredibly faithful and patient and persevering, and the pain remains. I think one place for people in chronic pain, I hope, to take some consolation is in knowing that the Apostle Paul, I think, had a physical pain that was more than just physical, but nevertheless, when he talks about a thorn in his flesh, we can surmise that there was something physical that really was hurting him, that God said, no, I'm not taking that away.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly why. And I'm not sure that Paul got to know exactly why, but we know that not all pain is something that God is going to heal in this life. One reason I think may be because the creation is groaning. That's something that
Yes.
Paul writes about,
Yes.
the groaning of creation, and that sense that our bodies bear witness to the brokenness of this world, to the brokenness in relationships, to the brokenness in the way we treat the earth, to the brokenness among whether it's political parties or different groups of people. So that's certainly not this huge consolation if you are someone experiencing pain. And yet there is a sense of, is there a way in which your body is bearing witness to what is broken in the world?
Sure.
I think it's so important that we never say it is your fault, or that there's no blame or shame around pain. And yet there is also an invitation to healing. And I think it's also really important to recognize, this is something I've learned so much through having a child with a disability. Oftentimes people write about people with Down syndrome and they'll say, Penny's my daughter's name, Penny suffers from Down syndrome. And it's like, well, she's actually like really happy. She gets sick less than my other children do. She would not tell you she has pain in her body. In what way is she suffering? And I would say if there is any way in which Penny is suffering, it is because of exclusion from friendships or relationships. And where's the fault in that, right? It's in a society that is built to not welcome people with Down syndrome. And that's true for people with chronic pain and illness as well, where there can be a sense of, we are not built to welcome you. And that is part of the pain. That's not the only pain, but there is a role, again, in connection, in friendship, in faithfulness, in care, one person to another.
Yes.
There's a role, a real deep healing role that we can all play in alleviating that kind of suffering. And so I think some people are in pain because the rest of us are not attending well to their needs and seeing them in the fullness of who they are, and being willing to live a life of healing love. So there are all sorts of reasons why people might be in pain. And it's great to ask questions of whether God has healing for us on an emotional and spiritual level that might affect our pain. But I just think it's so important at the same time that this never becomes some simplistic, well, if you just prayed hard enough, then you would be well, because that's not the answer.
No, I agreed. And thank you for saying that. I know so many people wrestle with that. That brings me to a topic that I personally care a lot about. And you describe it as participating in our healing experience with Jesus. That it's not that we sit back and just wait, but there are ways we can participate, that God calls us to participate. I think in the way you've talked about some of the social dynamics, that those of us who are alongside someone who may be experiencing pain or disability or a difference, that we are called to do our part there. But let's expand that a little bit more. How can we participate in this healing process?
Yeah, I think there are some different ways to go about that, thinking about our participation kind of for ourselves and our participation for the world. In terms of our own work, I think there are ways in which we can connect our bodies to our spirits, that God invites. So that can be either literally saying, okay, let me just notice my body in a prayerful way. I mean, literally sitting in a prayerful context and saying, God, what parts of my body should I be paying attention to? Where do I hold tension in my body? What memories might I associate with different parts of my body where I can either give thanks or say, yeah, that really hurts. Why is that? Is there something I need to understand from this part of my body being tense? One kind of easy, lots of us carry tension in our shoulders. And maybe that's just because we're typing at a computer for a while, or maybe it's because we are carrying in our minds and spirits more than we need to carry. And there's an invitation to ask Jesus to be with us in carrying that and to carry it for us. And I remember one time I was praying along these lines and I had a pretty clear sense from God that he was like, no, I will not carry that for you. We're just going to leave it right here. we're done. That's not a problem that either one of us is going to carry any longer. So again, you sometimes, it's not just like a quick fix. There's some revelation that can come through that type of participation, but there's an invitation to a conversation with God about our bodies, our minds, and our spirits. And there's more I could say on this and do in the book, but the other aspect that I would say when we think about participating in healing out in the world, there's a pattern in Jesus's healings that I think is really helpful in both our own personal and social experience of healing. And that is to pay attention to pain, which we don't like to do, but to say, okay, where does it hurt? And I think we can do that in our own bodies, but we also can do that in our communities. Where are the divisions? Where is the resentment? Where is the bitterness? Where is the brokenness? So pay attention to pain. And then secondly, ask for help. Yeah. To say, I don't know what to do about this. So maybe that means, again, thinking on a social level, finding someone to pray about a problem in your community and just saying, what can we do to help? We don't know. We might not know the answer, but what is it? And then the last thing is to take those small steps towards healing. What is the one thing you can do that would actually make a teeny, even if it's a teeny difference? What is it? And God will continue, I believe, to unfold, to reveal what the next step is. And especially when we connect with other Christians in prayer, I believe that is true, whether, again, that's in our own bodies or in our communities. So those are some of the ways we can participate in healing.
Oh, I love that. It reminds me of the question Jesus asked the man who was invalid and had been lying there 38 years. Do you want to be made well? Yes. And, we see that as, well, do you want to walk again? And yes, but the question is much deeper and, can really apply to so many things that you've talked here about healing. Do you really want to participate and take the steps both for your own emotional, mental, spiritual wounds, as well as the pain in your body, the people around you in your world who are hurting? Where does it hurt? Do you want to be made well? I think this is so much closer a picture of healing and well-being than too many of us have been led to believe. And I want to thank you, Amy and Julia, for just taking the time to be vulnerable and share your experiences of your own body and your own family, as well as been bringing us some theological foundations to help all of us on this journey of healing.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really grateful to get to talk about it. And I've been grateful on a very personal level to learn so much. When you start studying something, you learn a lot. And even just in having conversations, I feel like I continue to understand more. There's a real richness to from a Christian perspective, to looking at healing and to connecting it to our very lived experiences right now.
Yeah. Your book, To Be Made Well, An Invitation to Wholeness, Healing, and Hope. Just invite people to your stuff, your site, your podcast, your book, To Be Made Well, some really helpful things.
Well, I have this funny double name, Amy Julia. So it's actually pretty easy to find me online. So it's amyjuliabecker.com, where you could read an excerpt from the book. I also do have a podcast called Love is Stronger Than Fear. And there are links there. You can find it kind of wherever you get podcasts. And I did do a reading of that same excerpt on that podcast. And then on Instagram and Twitter, I'm Amy Julia Becker. And on Facebook, I'm Amy Julia Becker, writer. There also there's a discussion guide for the book. There's a YouVersion Bible plan that is just a 5-day kind of introduction. So there are lots of ways to investigate the themes of this book. And obviously the book itself is available to be made well wherever books are sold.
To Be Made Well. I've read it. I just want to say thank you for your story, for your work, and blessings to you in continuing to help people experience healing.
Thank you. You too.
Where do you hurt? I hope that question has been elucidated a bit more. And even more importantly, this has helped you understand some of the pathway forward in what it might look like for you to be made well, as well as to help others around you be made well. Make sure to check the links under this video. We'll have the link to Amy Julia Becker's website, social media, and the book, To Be Made Well, An Invitation to Wholeness, Healing, and Hope. I'd also like to invite you to come to our website, drcarolministries.com, and check out some of the material there about healing and wholeness. There will be some links under this video to a couple articles about how you can experience God's wellness system in all the different aspects that you need to experience wholeness. And you can also leave me a message. I love to hear from you. You can certainly leave a message under this video, a comment. You can also, if you need to leave a confidential message, use the contact page on our website. That comes directly to me. I'll respond personally. And I pray that you experience a beautiful measure of healing and wholeness from Jesus today, tomorrow, and going forward. And until next time, may God bless you.